The campfires burned low in the desert, their circles of light flickering against the canvas of the tents. Men sat close, shoulders wrapped in cloaks, rifles stacked in the sand. The night was dry and cold, stars sharp above, the dunes stretching away in silence. It had been a long march, and the fires were meant to hold back the emptiness, to remind the hunters that they were not alone under the endless dark. Wood cracked softly, smoke drifted upward, and the murmurs of conversation blurred into the hiss of wind. Then the sound came. A laugh. Not from the men. Not from the circle of tents. From beyond. It broke across the camp like a blade dragged against stone, high, sharp, rising into a cackle that should have scattered the jackals from the outskirts. But no animals moved. The desert held still. The men froze. One stood quickly, eyes narrowing into the dark. Rifles shifted from their piles, hands tightening around the wood. But nothing moved beyond the circle of firelight. No shape on the dunes. No shadow among the rocks. The laugh came again. Louder this time, stretched longer, thin and cruel, echoing without source. The men glanced at one another, their expressions hard, but their shoulders stiff with unease. Hyenas roamed the desert, everyone knew that. But they laughed at kills, at prey torn down, at scraps and hunger. This was not that. This laugh carried no scent of blood. No chase. No reason. It was laughter at nothing. The fire crackled once, then hissed. Flames bent sideways, shrinking low, as though the night itself had leaned closer. The men instinctively pulled tighter into the circle, rifles ready, eyes scanning the dark. And for the first time that night, the desert felt wider than they had remembered. The laugh faded into silence. But the silence was heavier than before, as though the sound had left something behind that would not leave with it. The fire should have burned steady. Dry wood in the desert always did, strong flame, long coals. But after the laughter, the flames shifted. They bent, not with the wind, but toward the dark beyond the camp, as though pulled by breath no one could feel. The men noticed. None of them spoke. They sat closer, their bodies stiff, watching as their own shadows stretched long and thin across the sand. The shapes should have pointed outward, away from the flames, but instead they bent sideways, leaning toward the edge of the firelight, toward the place where the sound had come. One man shifted, testing. He moved his arm, waving it slowly. His shadow moved too, but sluggishly, delayed, like something pulling it back. Another spat into the sand, but the shadow of his head did not bend as his body did. It remained locked, leaning toward the same place as the others. The laughter did not return. The night was silent now. Too silent. Even the wind had stopped moving. The air felt close, as though the desert itself was listening. A boy at the edge of the fireline reached for his rifle, but his hand shook so badly he let it fall back into his lap. He was staring not at the shadows but at the fires. The flames were shrinking. Not burning out, shrinking, as if the wood itself had grown reluctant to burn. The crackle grew faint, the hiss soft, and then all at once, sparks rose and drifted sideways, vanishing before reaching the air. The hunters leaned closer, waiting for heat. But none came. The fire glowed, but it no longer gave warmth. The shadows still leaned outward, unnaturally long, reaching like arms toward the desert beyond. And in the silence, each man knew the same thing: something stood outside the circle. Something that had not stepped forward, but had already taken hold of their light. The desert is a place of echoes. Every call, every crack of stone, every voice carries, repeating until distance swallows it. But when the laugh came again, it did not echo. It rose sudden and sharp, curling through the air, longer this time, a jagged sound that cut across the camp. The men flinched, rifles jerked upward, but when the cackle ended, the night fell back into silence like water closing over a stone. No return. No fading repeat. Nothing. The hunters stared at one another. A sound with no echo in the desert meant only one thing: it wasn't meant to travel. It had been thrown straight at them, sharp as an arrow, meant only to strike the circle of tents. The boy who had dropped his rifle before tried to whisper a prayer. His lips moved, but the sound came out thin, almost flat, as though the air refused to carry his words beyond his teeth. The others sat rigid. Some tightened their grips on rifles, others stared at the dying fires, but all felt the same weight in their chests. Then came the worst part. The laugh began again, short bursts this time, broken into uneven barks. But it wasn't outside the camp anymore. It was above them. Men lifted their heads sharply, eyes wide. Nothing there. Only stars, bright and clear. The sky held no shape, no wings, no movement. But the sound fell from above, circling as if the desert sky itself had learned how to laugh. Still, no echo. The sound died instantly each time, clipped, severed, leaving behind a silence so thick the men could hear their own hearts pounding. The fires hissed again, sparks rising, but this time not into air. They vanished upward, cut short in the dark before they could scatter. The laugh came one final time, low, dragging, stretched too long, then stopped. And when it stopped, the silence pressed so heavily that the men understood what had changed. The desert was no longer empty. It was listening. The fires faltered all at once. They did not gutter from lack of wood, nor collapse under wind. The flames drew inward, curling low, as if choking on something thick and unseen. Smoke rose in sudden, heavy plumes, but instead of drifting skyward, it folded down into the camp, sinking toward the men. It clung to their faces, damp and suffocating. Eyes watered, throats burned, yet the smoke had no smell. No resin, no char, no hint of fire. Just a bitter thickness that filled the lungs without weight. One hunter staggered back, coughing, but no sound left his mouth. His chest heaved, his lips parted, but the air gave him nothing in return. He collapsed to his knees, clawing at his throat. Another rushed to him, pulling him upright, but the same thing happened, breath stolen mid-gasp, voice swallowed. The men panicked. Rifles rose again, though at what they could not say. Their own fires had betrayed them, their own smoke suffocating them where they sat. And through it all, the laughter did not return. The hyena had gone silent. Which made the silence worse. The flames dimmed further, now barely clinging to the blackened wood. Their light glowed dull and red, pulsing faintly, like the last beat of a heart too weak to push blood. The smoke thickened, swirling low around the tents, blinding the men to one another. Their shapes became shadows, shifting and warped, stretched long as if the smoke had made them into something else. Then, as sudden as it had begun, the choking stopped. The smoke thinned, vanishing into the sand, leaving behind only cold coals. The fires were dead. Every one. The men stood in the dark now, rifles clenched, hearts hammering, sweat frozen against their necks. And from somewhere beyond the dead flames, deep in the dunes, the laugh came again. Low. Cruel. Endless. The men gathered what little light they could, torches sparked from the last embers, lanterns lit with trembling hands, but the desert refused to hold it. The glow stretched only a few steps before fading, swallowed whole by the dunes. Beyond the circle of men, the night was absolute. They searched the sand for signs. A hyena's tracks should have been there, clawed prints, uneven gaits, scatterings of disturbed earth. They spread out cautiously, rifles raised, scanning with lanterns. But the sand was smooth. Not smooth as if wind had passed, there was no wind now. Smooth as though nothing had ever touched it. Even their own prints behind them were gone, erased within moments. Every step they took faded the second they lifted their feet, leaving the ground unbroken, untouched. One man dropped to his knees and dragged his palm across the dune. The grain shifted under his weight, warm, familiar, but as soon as he lifted his hand, the mark was gone. Perfect again. Seamless. The hunters grew restless. Some muttered that they were being led in circles. Others swore that the desert was alive, wiping itself clean, unwilling to remember them. Then came the sound. Not laughter this time. A scrape. Low, steady, like claws dragging over stone. It came from everywhere at once, humming through the sand as if the desert itself was being scored by unseen hands. The men froze, lanterns shaking. The sound built slowly, rising, until it was almost unbearable. Then it stopped. The lantern flames flickered, bending low, and when the men turned again toward the camp, the tents were still there. But they no longer looked familiar. Their outlines were stretched, edges blurred, as if the desert itself had drawn them wrong. And from beyond them, faint but unmistakable, the laugh started once more. Not closer. Not farther. Just there. In a desert that no longer held tracks. They saw it at last. Not moving, not circling, not slipping between dunes. Just standing. The hyena stood at the edge of the camp, no more than 20 paces from the nearest tent. Its body was lean, fur patchy, shoulders hunched high like broken bone. But its eyes caught the lantern light and held it, not wild, not frantic, but fixed. Calm. Waiting. The men raised their rifles instantly, but none fired. The weight of the night pressed too heavily against their hands. Their barrels trembled, muzzles trained on the animal's chest, but their fingers would not close. The hyena's mouth opened slowly, lips curling back. Not in hunger. Not in fear. A grin that was almost human stretched across its muzzle, and then the sound came. The laugh. But this time it wasn't sharp or jagged. It was low, steady, bubbling like a voice choking on its own amusement. It rolled out into the silence and died without echo, sinking into the sand. The men felt it in their teeth. In their bones. The hyena did not move closer. It did not retreat. It only stood there, staring at the circle of men, laughter spilling into the space between them as the flames of the lanterns bent toward it, as though the fire itself was listening. One man shouted then, breaking the silence with a cracked voice. His words were lost instantly, swallowed by the laugh. His lantern flared once, then went dark, smoke curling upward before vanishing into nothing. The hyena didn't flinch. It only laughed harder. And in that moment, the men realized the fire hadn't died by accident. The smoke hadn't smothered them by chance. The animal was not outside the camp anymore. It was already inside it. The hyena did not advance. It did not lunge, did not circle, did not break the line of men. It simply stood at the edge of the dead fires, its body crooked against the pale starlight, its eyes fixed on the camp as though it had been there long before the tents were raised. The laughter rolled out again, sharp now, jagged, bursting from its throat in uneven bursts. But the sound carried no echo, no trail across the dunes. It began and ended in the circle of tents, as if the desert itself refused to share it. The hunters tried to hold their ground, rifles raised, shoulders locked. Yet one by one, their arms grew heavy. The barrels dipped. Their eyes blurred with smoke that was no longer there. Their chests ached from breaths that came too shallow, too weak. The fires, long dead, smoldered once more, not with flame, but with faint red coals that pulsed in rhythm with the laugh. Each burst of sound made the ashes glow, then fade, as though the animal's voice had replaced the fire itself. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the laugh broke. It ended mid-breath, cut clean, leaving behind silence that dropped over the camp like stone. The air was colder now. The stars seemed farther away. Even the desert wind refused to move. The hyena closed its mouth slowly, teeth vanishing behind black lips. It turned its head, not toward the dunes, not toward the men, but toward the sand itself, as if acknowledging something deeper. Then it sat. The hunters stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to speak. And in that stillness, the last ember of fire winked out. No heat. No sound. No light. Only the memory of a laugh that had come from nothing and left everything silent. When a hyena laughed at nothing, the desert camp fell quiet. And the fires died for good.